Hi everyone, welcome back to Introduction to Cozy Science Fiction and Fantasy, to the third installment, Influences on Contemporary Cozy Science Fiction and Fantasy Authors. I am Essel Duff Cooper. I am still a cozy science fiction and fantasy author, avid reader of the genre, and independent scholar of the genre. So again, as a little bit of housekeeping, if you haven't seen the previous two videos, I am not talking about cozy horror because I don't read horror and I don't have enough understanding or experience of the genre to say anything remotely sensible. So we're not doing that. Secondly, if there is anything that you would like me to talk about in terms of when it comes to cozy science fiction and fantasy, please let me know, and I will do my best to answer it in a follow-up video. This is the last of 3 pre-recorded videos where I realized that I kind of sort of ran out of stuff that I was reasonably sure that people might be interested in if they're not as well versed in cozy science fiction and fantasy as I am. I may be completely wrong. Maybe this isn't the interesting part. There are other things that people find interesting. Hopefully by now I've gotten comments on other videos for ideas and things to talk about, but we'll see. If you have anything, please do let me know, and I will hopefully make a video about it that will go up eventually, because I don't know when you're watching this. You may be watching this 5 years into the future, and then maybe I will not be making more videos on the topic, but we'll see. Yeah, so I think that's roughly most. Oh no, it's one more housekeeping thing. I am using the most objective definition for cozy science fiction and fantasy that we currently have. It is a writer's definition in the first video that I did. It is not going to be just the vibe. Although in this case it probably kind of is going to be, because we're looking specifically at the influences rather than at, you know, what makes cozy tick, or how do we define cozy and why do we define it that way. I should also get my notes ready because I'm gonna need those. But yeah, that's roughly it. So we're going to be talking about the influences on cozy science fiction and fantasy. I was slightly too fast there. But we have conscious influences and subconscious influences, which is basically, in my definition, is going to be, we have the influences that people talk about when we ask, like, what are your inspirations? And then we have, like, the subconscious one that you may not necessarily consider or think about. But that do seem to come up a lot when you talk about cozy science fiction and fantasy more critically. So, conscious influences. As I just said, these are the influences that writers will mention in interviews and articles that they are writing on their upcoming books that are cozy, or marketed or considered cozy. So these differ per writer. Like, obviously, like, everybody is influenced by different things. But in this case, as I said, it's specifically titles that cozy science fiction and fantasy authors bring up when they talk about their bookish influences. And in this particular case, there are a couple of titles that get mentioned a lot, if not every single time. I haven't actually double checked it to see if it's every single time, but it is often enough to be like, okay, so if you want to study this academically, then this is a book or a title that we need to look at. We cannot ignore this. So very often people will mention Diana Wynne Jones, who was a British children's author. And very specifically, they will mention Howl's Moving Castle. You will also very often see Studio Ghibli mentioned. Very often they will talk about Kiki's Delivery Services specifically. But there is also overlap, because Studio Ghibli did an adaptation of Howl's Moving Castle. And sometimes it's very unclear in the interview whether they're talking about the Studio Ghibli adaptation or the original book, or if they're talking about both and just kind of conflating them into one. But basically, if it's Ghibli or Diana Wynne Jones, it is going to matter unless it's like their adult fiction or the more violent fiction. For Diana Wynne Jones, it would be, which one is The Time of the Ghost, I think is an example of what probably would not be included by authors. And for Studio Ghibli, it will be like Princess Mononoke. You also very often see Terry Pratchett mentioned. And if it's Terry Pratchett, then it's very likely specifically going to be the Guards subseries of Discworld, and most likely it's going to be Guards specifically, like the first one in that subseries. And this is basically just because the thing that people then resonate with is Vimes, and the down-to-earth setting that Vimes has, kind of compared to like the Witches series, because you could also list Esme Weatherwax. But it tends to be Vimes. So these are the influences that most cozy science fiction and fantasy authors seem to mention or at least the prominent ones seem to mention when it comes to their influences. So if you want to start like with a conscious influence of what influenced these writers like directly, these are the titles to look for. But we also, as I mentioned, have subconscious influences, and these are a lot less clear. We are very unlikely to find a cozy fantasy author or a cozy science fiction author who is going to be like, oh, I wanted to write something like Anne of Green Gables but with dragons, unless that is exactly what they wrote. But it's going to be things like that, things that have some potential to lead into what we currently understand as cozy science fiction and fantasy, and this is a much bigger list. So these may not be elements that authors draw on deliberately, but they may draw on them. So for example, we have fan fiction, and especially alternate universe coffee shop settings. Some authors will have no draw on this. I don't read fan fiction. I did when I was like a teenager, but I wouldn't be able to tell you like specifically what a coffee shop alternate universe really needs. But this is a way of telling stories that is smaller scale and more contained than, you know, the original main plot. And people who do read fantasy, who do read fan fiction, and who write fan fiction, may subconsciously draw on this. Slice of life fiction as well. A lot of cozy science fiction and fantasy authors that I've seen have grown up watching anime, which does tend to have, or at least the older anime had at least some level of slice of life effect to it. Like if you take the original Sailor Moon, which a lot of people will know, or you can take Cardcaptor Sakura as well. There is a divide there between a good amount of slice of life, girls hanging out in school, dealing with girl problems and social situations, and the monster fighting. There's a balance there, and that slice of life balance bit that we kind of have lost in more modern, shorter narratives. Like a Sailor Moon Crystal has barely any of that because the manga doesn't. But it's much more fast paced. It doesn't really have room to like really explore like Usagi's relationship with her brother or her mother and that kind of stuff. And some people are like, but this is the part that I really like. So then they draw on that, and they may not realize that that's what they're doing. Cozy mystery. This is a big one. Every single time I have done a talk about cozy science fiction and fantasy and talked about the influences, there has been someone who has brought up cozy mysteries. Whether that is because they're expecting cozy science fiction and fantasy to have arisen from cozy mystery as a genre, or whether that is because they just see a lot of overlap. Because there is a lot of overlap. I've gone into some of the overlap in the previous video on the cozy vibe. But it's not necessarily going to be a conscious influence. It's also very often can be a TV one. Like, you could be inspired to write a cozy fantasy because you love Death in Paradise, or you love Midsummer Murders. And you will use the vibes that make that cozy and that make that tick to then write the cozy that authors are writing. So we have that. We also have D&D sessions, and then noticeably, like, obviously the less combat heavy ones, like the shopping episodes, or the episodes where your PCs are mostly talking to themselves. Those kind of situations, that can also be an influence on people. We have the Hallmark Christmas specials, or just, the Hallmark specials in general. Low tension, cozy vibe, happily ever afters all around. Some people want that. You can see this specifically in the cozy romance elements of cozy science fiction and fantasy. Those tend to lean there a bit more. It can be as simple as just the utopian type settings you get in Star Trek. Or like Babylon 5 is I think another big one, but I haven't watched Babylon 5. And it's like, okay, so cool, what is life on a space station actually going to be like? And then there's your plot. That's it. That's what you want to explore. What is life like on a space station? What's it actually like to live on Mars? Like, forget all like, okay, so there's a huge gap in the dome and everybody's about to die, we have to fix it kind of plot. What is it like to actually physically live on Mars? Like that kind of story. That's where this influence can come from as well. For a lot of authors, it comes from the fantasy of manor genre and the 80s and 90s women's fantasy in particular. There's overlap between those. You can also see that in like Diana Wynne Jones. This is the time that Diana Wynne Jones was writing. This is also the time that Terry Pratchett was writing most of his work. So these older books that have the potential to lead into cozy science fiction and fantasy, which is very often fantasy of manners, because this is a social setting. It's like, just a regular novel, a book about manners, like your Jane Austen, but make it fantasy. And that kind of vibe. Fantasy romance, again, can be an influence, especially on obviously going to be the romance authors writing cozy science fiction and fantasy, and the cozy science fiction fantasy romance genre in general. Like, that doesn't really need much explanation, I don't think. We also have 19th century sentimental fiction, which is Anne of Green Gables and books like that. So this is predominantly, again, women's fiction. And they deal with small time settings. Do I really need to define explain what Anne of Green Gables is about? It's about a girl growing up. And then later in the later books, it's about Anne living her life with her family in like a new place where she becomes, I believe, a teacher at some point. One of her sons goes off to war and she has to deal with that. And it's slice of life fiction in a way, but from the 19th century or like slightly up from there. And those can also be influences because they're also like the influence on like fantasy of manners and on women's fantasy, because that's what women were probably reading around that time. Like those are the types of books. And then we come to the really literary part, where I need my notes for, which is eucatastrophe and cozy catastrophe. So eucatastrophe is an idea from J.R.R. Tolkien, and cozy catastrophe is by Brian Aldiss, and I'm kind of grouping them together for now because they're not roughly the same thing, but they kind of relate and they kind of don't. So eucatastrophe is a sudden positive turn of fortune brought on by grace rather than heroic force. So basically, God makes your life better. You can kind of play with that a little bit, because not everybody is that kind of Christian anymore, but you can still be with that, like, okay, so we're not dealing with God making it better, we're dealing with the author making it better. So for example, in Legends and Lattes, I can't read my notes, they're this tiny. So Legends and Lattes kind of deconstructs this idea. So warning, spoilers for Legends and Lattes. So in Legends and Lattes, Viv wants to retire from the mercenary business, and she wants to make what is derogatively sometimes called magical Starbucks or fantasy Starbucks. And but she does that. One piece of loot that she gets from her final outing is a stone that brings luck. That is the idea. She buries the stone where she wants to build her cafe and build her new life. and she attributes everything that happened to her to the magic of the stone. Like every good thing that happens to Viv happens because the stone is magic and is bringing luck to her. This is not how the stone works. We learn this right at the very end of the novel. What the stone does is bring like-minded people together. So she has a sudden positive turn of fortune because suddenly everyone is there to help her and build her up and make a lovely, nice community. But it's not through any kind of heroic force. It is also not through grace. It's just through the power of Viv's personality and the tiny bit of nudge that Stone gives for finding, personalities that she really meshes with to make something beautiful, and then she does. So that's kind of sort of how you can see that in cozy science fiction and fantasy. But yeah, it's interesting. Mostly it goes the other way, to be honest. Brian Aldiss's Cozy Catastrophe is slightly more interesting in terms, and slightly more easy to apply. The idea behind Aldiss's Cozy Catastrophe is at some point there was a big apocalyptic event and people have to rebuild, and then Cozy Catastrophe is a story about that rebuilding. So the actual definition, and I'm going to get my notes so I can actually read it properly, is a sudden non-violent event wipes out most of civilization and survivors rebuild in comfort. So there may not seem like a lot of overlap except for the survivors rebuild in comfort bit, but you are looking at those lower stakes of how do you rebuild after your world is completely destroyed. And in this case, very specifically, we have a non-violent event, and we do not want conflict or tension in a lot of our cozy. So how do we rebuild after World War III is much less likely to be, the premise for a cozy science fiction and fantasy book. It can, but it's much more unlikely. So we do see some overlap between these, and especially the cozy science fiction and fantasy books that are published today and that are considered, cozy fantasy, like Legends and Lattes, Can't Have Treason Without Tea, and those kind of books. So in these we can see or the Spell Shop even, we can see that people are trying to make a fresh start. We can see that they have found a new purpose in life, which is, a life with everybody else. We can see some kind of domestic traits or work traits that are useful to people. In the Spell Shop's case, for example, is making jam, which is the quintessential example for that. So this is kind of where some subconscious influences can come from. Eucatastrophe and Cozy Catastrophe are the most unlikely because they are, to be honest, literary concepts where it's more if you write about academia, then you can use these ideas to pull this through. But it's not going to be a conscious thing, because a lot of authors will have read J.R.R. Tolkien, but they will not know that there are elements in his books where he's this is a eucatastrophe. And they may not necessarily know that because they're not huge Tolkien geeks. I only discovered this in trying to understand what influences might exist on cozy and running into eucatastrophe as a term. But so these are some of the things that can influence cozy science fiction and fantasy. If you are looking at cozy science fiction and fantasy as books, this is some of the stuff that you can look at in terms of how does this map onto where the genre has come from, what are the building blocks, that kind of thing that we may not realize are there. Because a lot of the time, a lot of people are cozy fantasy came in existence as a response to grimdark, and that is all it is. And it has years-long history to it and a lot of elements for it to draw on that get ignored if you present it as nothing but a response to grimdark. So if you want to look at cozy science fiction and fantasy in a more scholarly way, or look at where authors might be drawing their inspirations from, these are good places to start looking. Again, this is going to depend on the author. I don't play D&D myself, so for example, for me, looking at, okay, so D&D sessions is not going to be a huge subconscious influence on me because I just don't have that experience. Whereas 19th century sentimental fiction, which I have read a decent amount about because 19th century fiction and earlier was kind of my university topic, and I enjoyed. They're very nice to read, and I read a lot of them during my last job as well because they were free on Gutenberg. So that is a conscious influence. That is a more conscious influence on me, and it's something where it's like, okay, so can we see where Ella Blanchard, I believe it was Ella Blanchard, has an influence on what Dove is writing in this book? Like, that is something that you can do with my books that you may not be able to do with like Travis Baldree. With Travis Baldree, you would be much more effective to look at potential D&D session influences. And there we go. But yeah, so these are some of the influences that people can have, and I hope you found that interesting. And again, thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions or suggestions for topics for me to talk about when it comes to cozy science fiction and fantasy, please let me know and I will see what I can do. But until then, unless I got so many comments that I've been able to make another video, this series is currently concluded. So until then, I hope you have a lovely time. And until then, goodbye!